My message today is the second in our Easter series, What Shall I Do with Jesus? This one is based on the story of Judas Iscariot. I call it Judas was disappointed in him. It's Matthew 26, verses 10 to 16. That's my main text. But of course, I'll be touching on some other gospel accounts of the life of Judas as well. Now, I'd like to tell you, as your pastor, that I understand the Bible. And I feel like I'm starting to. And I dig in to understand more every day. But there are some things in there that I feel like I will never understand. And a lot of that revolves around the people of the Bible and their choices. Samson, for example. That guy makes me scratch my head every time I read his story. I just want to say, dude, why? And some of the others I'm starting to get. I understand how even though Joseph's brothers did basically everything wrong to him, how our God, who is sovereign over all, could use Joseph and even his brothers' misdeeds for good to keep his promise to Abraham. I understand how David fell with Bathsheba. He faced temptation and he didn't turn away. And in the process, this man after God's own heart became a cautionary tale, showing us how we can do better. I'm starting to understand how Peter could deny Jesus. But that's next week's sermon, Lord willing. So that I'll just leave at that for now. But there's one guy who I never ever thought I would understand. A guy named Judas Iscariot. Now, the greatest villain in the Bible is Satan. Let's not kid ourselves. But Judas, you know, is right there at the top of the list. How could he sit under the teaching of Jesus for 3 years, pretty much the whole length of Jesus' ministry on earth, and still manage to betray Jesus unto death? I never understood it, but maybe I'm starting to. You see, the key to understanding the Bible is learning to understand God. We need to understand that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. We need to know that no one can foil God's plan, and that God can work through anyone and everyone to accomplish his purposes here on earth. He can even work through a guy like Judas. Was what Judas did despicable? Yes. Was it unexpected? You be the judge. In Mark chapter 3, where it talks about Jesus choosing his disciples, it says, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. And verse 14 picks it up. He appointed 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have the authority to drive out demons. Notice it said Jesus chose the ones he wanted. It gives a list of the men Jesus chose in the next few verses. And then verse 19, right at the end of the list, says, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, does that mean Jesus got it wrong? Did he pick the wrong guy? I don't think so. I mean, I've entered into friendships with people over the years where I invested in people who ended up blindsiding me and making me wish I had chosen different, maybe even chosen better. But I don't think that happens to Jesus. So we see what we should already know. That Jesus chose someone he knew would betray him. He did it on purpose. And his purpose, while it would become excruciatingly painful for Jesus, was a great purpose. In case you think this was a recent decision for Jesus at that time, you should know it goes way back before that day that he called these men and chose them on the mountainside. If you look at Psalm 41, verse 9, for example, it says, even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. Now, the Bible tells us that Psalm 41 is a psalm of King David. And we know that David reigned around 1000 BC. And yet this story sounds remarkably like some passages we're about to read from the story of the crucifixion. God knew this was going to happen, and Jesus knew this was going to happen. The plan for Jesus to die on the cross was made a long time before any of this happened. I would maintain that God planned this before humanity was even created because he knew in advance what would happen. He knew everything wrong that we would ever do. He knew what our sin would cost Jesus, and he created us anyway because he made us to love us and for us to love him. Now, I'm not a person who's big on predestination, at least as some people see it. I believe God has made everyone with a choice to choose him. But I also believe that God knows the choices we are going to make long before we make them. He knew the choice Judas would make. And while that choice was completely sinful, and it was, and Judas was to blame for that choice, God knew it would work out for the salvation of many. Now that's the spirit realm side of it. But I still have a question. Why would Judas do such a thing? What made him make that choice? What made him betray Jesus from the human side of things? Because if we can learn that, maybe we can learn the lesson and make better choices. As I read the story of Judas, I come to a conclusion. A conclusion that I think is correct. I think Judas was disappointed in Jesus. Now, I know disappointed sounds like a really wimpy word to use in this situation when such a heinous choice was made. But where does disappointment come from? Well, I think about times when I was disappointed. Think about a time when you were disappointed. I'm going to give you a lighthearted, kind of funny one. I remember when I was a kid. It was Christmas morning. I had one toy that I had asked for, and I saw a box on the floor under the tree, wrapped up beautifully, that I was sure was the gift that I really wanted. My mom wrapped it up so nicely, my eyes were locked in on it. I couldn't wait to open that box. I was so excited. I had my thank you speech already roaming around in my mind. I was filled with anticipation. And then I opened the box. And it was not filled with the toy of my dreams for that year. Instead, it held a gift that every boy needs and no boy wants: socks and underwear. I was disappointed. Why? Because the gift did not meet my expectations. I think disappointment has everything to do with what we expect. It has everything to do with expectations. And so it was, I believe, with Judas. At the start of Jesus' ministry, from the proclamations of John the Baptist to the prophecies he was fulfilling to the miracles he was doing, many people were expecting that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. The disciples were clearly expecting Jesus to be the Messiah. And of course, Jesus actually is the Messiah, the king who would rule forever. Now forget about what you know about the kingship of Jesus for just a second. Think about worldly kings. What kinds of things do you associate with worldly kings? I think of things like money and power and prestige and influence and authority. These are things that most people would like to have, right? These are things that most people would want. And then I think about these guys who Jesus called to the mountainside. The ones he selected, the 12, Jesus' inner circle. If he was going to be the king who would rule forever, what would their lives be? What would their expectations be? Probably money, power, prestige, influence, and authority. And we know this to be true because numerous times throughout the Gospels we see the disciples jockeying for position. They want to be the most important of the 12, right? These were their expectations. Their expectations, at least in the beginning, were that they were in line for really big, important stuff. Now, to be clear, they were. But it was not the big, important stuff they expected. Now, most of them grew and adapted the more they knew Jesus. But what about Judas? Well, let's look at a very familiar incident right near the end of Jesus' earthly life. In John 12:1, it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Okay, we know this story pretty well, right? But let's pretend for a minute that we don't. This is pure nard. This is perfume. This is very expensive perfume. At another point in this passage, it says it was worth a year's wages. Think about this. How much was the highest amount of money you ever made in a year? You don't have to tell me. I'm not really asking. I just want you to picture that amount. This was the money you worked hard for. This is the money you earned by working away at least 2,000 hours of your life. Do you have that picture in your mind? Now I want you to imagine that I brought here a bottle of perfume. And I told you that I had spent your highest year's salary of my own money to purchase it. I looked you all in the eye and said, as an act of worship, I'm going to pour this out here at the pulpit before the Lord. What would your reaction be? Would you think, how spiritual or how stupid? Now, I haven't even brought into it the idea that this may have been something Mary was saving for her future. It might have even been an engagement gift. Think of this that way, and the value of the perfume goes up even higher. And she just poured it out. She just poured it out on Jesus' feet. It can't be recovered. It can't be saved. One shot, and it's done. Now, hopefully we who know the story and know what's about to happen see it as a beautiful act of worship. After all, that's how Jesus saw it. But if you didn't know the story, if you didn't know what was going to happen next, is that what you would think? Look at verse 4. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. Now, again, if you don't know the story, you might look at this and say, well, Judas was just being a good steward. This is something of a lot of value that she just dumped away. And if this verse was where it ended, you might be right. But look at verse 6. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Judas isn't a good steward. Judas is a thief. Look, time is running out for these guys. If this is 6 days till the Passover, this is 5 days left in Jesus' earthly life. And while Judas doesn't know it yet, he only has 6. He's not going to change. He cares more about money than he cares about Jesus. In Matthew 26, you see Jesus' response to Judas and the others. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." And so it's just been done once again. See, Jesus sees this thing that Mary just did as an act of worship. So in this and other incidents, like when Jesus tells the disciples he will die, rather than be like the earthly kings of his day, Judas was beginning to see, or so we think, that if his only interest is in money and power, he has hitched himself to the wrong person. Once again, Judas, like so many others, can't see that what Jesus offers is so much greater. His only care was for what he thought he could get out of following Jesus. Friends, people still get hooked on that today. Their expectations of what a life following God and a life blessed by God looks like are vastly different than what they get. They expect a life of ease and material blessings of the world. And God can certainly give them, and sometimes he does, to those who need them and can handle them. But what we need to realize is the blessings of the world are just that, of the world. And they can trap us if we're not careful. If we allow ourselves to care more about the gift than the giver, we can find ourselves in a world of hurt. That's what's happening to Judas. What was Judas's next move? Matthew 26:14. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. It seems Judas thought he was going to get a financial benefit from following Jesus one way or the other. If he couldn't get a corner office in the palace of the king who would rule forever, he would sell out the king for 30 pieces of silver, which in their day was the price of a slave. The king of all kings sold for the price of a slave. Judas should have just stuck with Jesus. Instead, he plotted against the Savior of the world. But here's the thing. What he did against Jesus ended up putting Jesus in the place to save the world. You might still wonder how Judas could have done such a thing, and you're not alone. I mean, you think about all that Judas had seen, all the miracles, all the healings, all the demonstrations of God's power. He could have been part of the greatest story ever told, and I guess he was, but instead of being a hero, reaching a city, building a church, making a difference, changing the world, he became the villain in the story. How could he do it? Well, the thing is, he had help. If you look at John 13, verse 2, it says, "The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus." Remember this. The enemy is not all-knowing. His mission is to steal, kill, and destroy. And his biggest target of all time was Jesus. Little did he know to strike down Jesus would not be his greatest victory, it would be his greatest defeat. When Jesus died, he brought about the salvation of the world. He gave hope to sinners, past, present, and future. And of course, death could not hold him, and he rose again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's another place where we can see Judas's fundamental problem. Matthew 26, starting with verse 20. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." By now, we've moved to the last night of Jesus' earthly life. He says this, that somebody is going to betray him. Verse 22 says, "They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, 'Surely you don't mean me, Lord.'" Look, here's the fulfillment of Psalm 41:9 right here. Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him." In other words, everything God said would happen will happen just the way he said it would. The word will be fulfilled. Jesus is saying, in essence, I will die on the cross. My wounds will heal the nations, all who believe. Every word God said about me through the prophets, through all time, will be fulfilled. And then Jesus says, "But woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Now look at verse 25. See if you can spot the difference between Judas and everybody else. In verse 25, it's then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." Did you catch the difference? When Jesus told the 12 that one of them would betray him, 11 of them said, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." But look what Judas said. "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." This is what we saw in the C.S. Lewis quote last week, right? This is the last night of Jesus' earthly life. Tomorrow by this time, Jesus, will be lying dead in the tomb. Jesus will be lying dead in the tomb by the same time tomorrow evening. He'll be awaiting his resurrection. 11 None of the 12 call Jesus Lord. They believe Jesus is Lord. But all Judas's hardened heart can see is Jesus is a rabbi. In other words, he is a great teacher. And like we said last week, for what it's worth, it's true. Jesus is a great teacher. But that belief is not enough to save. Judas is the only one in that room who is not sold out to Jesus. So instead, he sold Jesus out for the price of a slave. And he'll never even get to spend the money. And in John 13, we'll see once again, Judas had help that was no help at all. John 13:27, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. And Jesus told him, what you are about to do, do quickly. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. The devil entered into him. There's a reason for that. Jesus was never in his heart. To Judas, Jesus was only a way to meet his needs. And when Judas's expectations were not met, Judas moved on. In the process, he moved from a master who loved him and wanted what was best for him to a master who wanted only to use him and then destroy him. That's what the enemy does, and it's all the enemy does. Judas leaves to do what he was convinced he had to do. And Jesus and the rest of the disciples headed to Gethsemane. It was a hard night for Jesus. Even Jesus hoped that there would be another way to save us. But when there was none, his answer to the Father was, thy will be done. Judas may have thought he sold Jesus to the religious leaders, but Jesus was already sold out to the will of the Father. Jesus was speaking to the 11 when this happened. Matthew 26:47. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. Think about how hard and cold that was. Judas leads the crowd to Jesus. Judas leads the crowd to Jesus. Judas knows what the end result of this will be. Judas knows, barring divine intervention, this story ends with Jesus on a cross. And what was his signal to the enemies of Jesus? That this was their man? A greeting of love. A symbol of love. A kiss. We call it the Judas kiss. A hypocritical kiss of betrayal. That kiss would be the last time Judas would see Jesus. Jesus was a man who sowed into Judas's life for 3 years. Jesus was a man who tried to bless and help and teach him. And Judas betrayed him. The enemy had led Judas to betray the King of Kings. But that's the thing about serving the enemy. When you serve Jesus, he's with you forever. He will love you forever. He will lead you through this life. He will be with you through every trial. He will lead you all the way home. He loves you with a perfect love. And he sent Jesus to the cross in your place. He took on what you and I deserve so that he could give us the eternal life that only Jesus deserves. We in the church, those who belong to him, are the bride. He is the bridegroom. And he is devoted to us forever, no matter what our earthly circumstances may be. Satan, the enemy, is different. He's not devoted to you at all. He hates you. And even if you serve him, he will use you up, throw you away, and await you in hell. Look what he did to Judas. Matthew 27:1. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. You know why? Because his helper was gone. Judas served his purpose. The enemy didn't need him anymore, and he was gone. The only thing Judas had left was a pocket full of blood money. And without the enemy to egg him on and convince him he was right to betray Jesus, all that was left was remorse and regret. The rest of verse 3 says, he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. It almost looks like Judas was trying to make things right, but it was too late. The deed had been done. Look at the response of the chief priests. These are the highest religious leaders of the people. Look how they treated this man who had given them exactly what they wanted. What's that to us, they replied. That's your responsibility. Once he had served his purpose, they didn't want him either. I think it's safe to say, whether they knew it or not, they were acting more like the enemy than the Lord. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. What a tragic end. And all because of disappointment. Friends, brothers, and sisters, I know this was not a happy message, but I think it's an important one. There are people out there who will tell you anything you want to hear. They will say that serving the Lord is a way to wealth, prosperity, and an easy life with no trouble and no turmoil. And if you have trouble or turmoil, then you are not right with God. Or maybe you just think that if life and things are hard and life is hard, then God is not in them. Or maybe you want to sign on with God to get the ease and the comfort and the wealth and the prosperity. So I need to tell you the truth. God will do everything he says he will do in his word. God will do everything he promised in his word. But he is under no obligation to give you and me what he has not promised. First of all, for someone to say, if something is hard, God's not in it, to say that is to ignore the example of Jesus. No one could be better than God incarnate. Yet Jesus' entire life was anything but easy. Jesus is the creator and the owner of everything. Yet he walked this earth with very little of what the world has to offer. Things did not go well for him, at least from an earthly perspective. And yet he was in the very center of God's will. If you are following Jesus and life is hard, don't be disappointed. He never promised you it would be easy. Instead, look to him and follow him and hold on to him and realize that what he has for you and me is greater than anything the world has to offer. He has come to give us eternal life, a life that starts not when we die, but at the moment we receive Jesus Christ. He promises to walk with us through this life and lead us into eternity in a place that is beyond our wildest dreams when this life is through. In the meantime, we get to live here in his presence, making the most of this life, living out his will, living a life of purpose, accomplishing his purposes on the way to a great reward. Don't get caught up in earthly expectations. That will only lead to disappointment. And sometimes, as we've seen in this story, disappointment can lead to disaster. Instead, focus on what he promised and move through this life to a place beyond even our greatest expectations. Amen.